Hey there, my name is Nick for Vimeo Video School, and in this series of lessons, I'm going to show you guys how to make a title sequence for your short film or movie using After Effects and Cinema 4D. Now, don't worry if you haven't used either of those programs. I'm going to make it really simple. You guys could follow along and make a cool little animation title sequence for your upcoming short film. So let's head on in, and I'll show you what we'll be making, and we'll get started. All right, so here's what we'll be doing in these series of lessons. We're going to take some shot film like this, just kind of handheld shot film. I took this with a little video camera, and we're going to add your logo or your movie title or whatever you want into the scene using Cinema 4D and After Effects. You can see here we're using the Vimeo logo, but of course we're going to be able to do this with whatever logo you want or even your name or anything like that. So let's get started. The first thing we need to do is for me, I need to go get that logo. And if you want to do it with the Vimeo logo, let me show you a page where you can find it. And this is under vimeo.com/press. And you can come over here and grab one of their logos. In this case, we're just going to grab the normal Vimeo logo. And it's a zip file. It'll download pretty quickly. When you go to your downloads, you're going to see you're going to have to unzip it by double-clicking. And inside, we have a whole bunch of logos here. And what we want is this EPS file. And this EPS file is a vector file that we're going to use Illustrator to prepare this logo or whatever you're using for Cinema 4D, so we could create that 3D type. So go ahead and drag this into Illustrator. And we only need to do a couple things to prepare this for Cinema 4D. Essentially, from here, all I need to do is export this as a Illustrator 8 file. And there's no real reason that it has to be an Illustrator 8 file other than Illustrator 8 is what Cinema 4D reads. It's just a basic vector file. So all we have to do is export. I'm going to call this _8, just so I know what it is. And we're going to make sure it's an Illustrator file. And then I'm going to make sure I put it inside of the Vimeo School folder here that I created just for this tutorial. And we're going to save. And it's going to ask us, what version do you want to save? And we just want to make sure it's version 8. And let me show you one last thing. If you guys are typing your logo or your name in Illustrator, there's only one extra thing you have to do before you export, and that's convert this to outlines. By default, all the text is going to be live. So what you have to do is kind of bake it in, and by going up to Type, Create Outlines, and then now you can see we have all this vector data and all these dots ready to go. From here, you do what I just did, which is export to version 8, and you're all set to go. The Vimeo logo is all set. It's already got the outlines here, so we are ready to go into Cinema, and let's import that vector file into Cinema 4D and start to make it 3D. So we can come up to File here and go to Merge Objects. And this is in our Objects menu here. We can go to Merge Objects and go find that Vimeo logo or whatever logo you're using and open up that Illustrator file. We're going to say Open, and it's going to ask us about the scale of the object. For me, I'm just going to keep it at 1 by default. We could always scale it up if we want. And you can see one thing it did is it imported it, but it's kind of off center. But we can fix that by just kind of moving it up and over with these kind of axis handles here. So now we have our basic, we have our logo in, but we need to make it 3D. Right now it's just spline data, kind of vector data, and what we're going to use is this extrude NURBS right here. And what extrude NURBS allows us to do is to take our logo and drop it in the hierarchy of the extrude NURBS just by pulling it up. You can see the arrow kind of point down right there. And now it's under the extrude NURBS. Nothing happened, and that's because we just need to click one more button. In the extrude NURBS itself, you want to come down and in your object menu and make sure it's in hierarchical here. And now you can see when we hit render, which is this little icon right there, we're going to get a real piece of 3D type, and we're on our way. Now, it doesn't look too great, but what we could start to do is texture it, add materials, and add a bunch of things here to make this look a little bit better. So what can we go from here? In the extrude NURBS, you can go to your caps, and the caps give us a lot of options to kind of style this text a little bit differently. Instead of just a square edge, instead we could add a fillet cap. There we go, right there. on the front and the back, and now you can see we kind of have a bevel going on. We can even make this bevel rounder by adding more steps to the bevel. So let's go ahead and add like 5 steps to this bevel. And for this bevel, it's a little bit maybe even too large. So let's just shrink this down to something like 1.5 or 1.2 or something like that. We just want a little bit of a bevel just to start to catch some light and reflections. You see now we have some reflections in here, or at least some specular hits, and that's going to make it a little bit more natural. Let's pretty this up a little bit more by adding a texture. So in your materials menu, you can say create new material, and you could drag that material just right onto the extrude NURBS, onto your logo, and that will create the material on your logo. From here, what we want to do is change the color of it. So we want that Vimeo blue, at least for my logo. You can make it whatever color you want, but let's find that nice Vimeo blue. It's got some good green in it. Somewhere around there. I can also color pick this if I wanted to, but you go ahead and make it whatever color you want for your logo, and you can see it updates right away in there, and we have our texture. Another thing we could do is add reflection. Now by default, when you turn reflection on, it's going to turn on 100% reflective, and we don't want this. This is like a mirror, right? We just want it subtly reflective. So what we can do is come into our texture and pick Fresnel. And what Fresnel does, it's a shader that essentially lets reflections on the edges be brighter than reflections that are aimed straight at the camera. And this is how reflections work in real life. Just like a lake, if you were to stare straight into a lake from the top, you could see down into it. But if you look at a lake from an angle, it reflects the sky. And that's that Fresnel happening in real life. So you always want to try to add that to your reflections. So we also want to turn it down. So let's turn our overall brightness down and our Fresnel down. So just so we have some subtle reflections and not a whole, crazy amount. And that's looking pretty good. Of course, we have nothing to reflect yet, but we're going to add that as we go. Let's now create a secondary beveled type around here just to make this a little bit more interesting. So let's go ahead and just duplicate our extrude NURBS. I'm going to select it. I'm going to hit Command C and Command V. And that's going to give us 2 copies. On this second copy, what I want to do is I want to change the caps to a larger cap. So on the radius of our second copy here, what I can say is like, let's go 6 instead of 1.2. And you're going to see what we can do now is take this secondary text and go ahead and grab it on the Z-axis. You can see we have our little angles here, and by the way, I'm moving, if you're new to Cinema 4D, I'm moving around using the 3, the 2, and the 1 on my keyboard by using those and your mouse or your trackpad. You can move around the scene this way by using 2 to zoom in, using 1 to pan around, and 3 to rotate. I guess I should have made that clear. But now what we could do is use this axis tool to just move the large cap behind the small cap. And you can see what it's creating is this layered effect that we have now a small cap and a large cap. And now from here, we can actually texture it separately. So let's go ahead and duplicate our texture by hitting Command C, Command V. And let's go into our new texture and change this to more of a white color. And now we can add this either by dragging it into the scene like we did before, or you can also drag it up into your objects menu and just replace the new texture with the or the old one with the new one. And now we have this kind of bubbly type. We have the Vimeo logo, kind of smaller and easy to read, and then we have a larger version around it that gives it kind of this beveled but more bubbly feel, and it's going to reflect more of our scene. One thing we could do is extrude these a little bit further, especially our outside one. Let's just make this a little bit more extruded by coming into our object menu here and adding a few centimeters of depth. And that is going to help, I think, when we start to composite this, and we're going to see a little bit more of our background. So our type is looking good, but we're missing quite a lot. what we're missing are reflections from our scene that we need to composite, right? We're also missing some lighting. There's no lighting going on. And what we're going to do is we're actually going to use a frame from our animation, from our, not the animation, but a frame from our original video to not only add reflections, but also lighting from within Cinema 4D. And so for that, what we need to do is we need to go into After Effects here, and we need to grab a frame from our video. So in After Effects, we need to import our video first. Let's go ahead and import that by double-clicking in our project menu here. And that's going to open up, and I could grab our Railroad Tracks video, and you can grab whatever video you want. Go ahead and go shoot some kind of handheld video, and you could use your own video for that if you want. So I'm going to pull this in, and I'm going to make a new composition by dragging it to this icon right here, and it's automatically going to create a new composition with this video as a layer that's ready to go. And what we can find is the normal kind of scene that we want to use as a background and also as a reflection map. And something like this, for me, is where I want it. You know, all this stuff is kind of a little too shaky for me, but this is our general composition. So I want to choose a frame from around here and just freeze frame on it. You know, just lift up your mouse, and what you want to do is export this as its own frame that we could then use in Cinema 4D to light and also to reflect stuff. So if we come up to composition, we can go to save frame as file. Boom. And that's going to put this frame into our render queue as a Photoshop file. So from here, we could rename it if we wanted to, but most importantly, we want to make sure it's being saved in the folder so we could find it later. So let's go ahead and call this background railroad. And if we could spell that, we could go ahead and save that. And we need now to head back into Cinema 4D and to import this texture. So we can create a new material, open that material by double clicking on it. Now we can go to our color channel, and if we click on this 3 dots over here, it's going to allow us to import our image. And there's one thing we didn't do yet. And I didn't do that before I left. So what we have to do is cancel, go to After Effects, and make sure we render this out. So you know, you make mistakes, that's all right. But you have to make sure you click render, and then that's going to render that Photoshop out. Now we're ready to go. All right, let's import this. This is our background railroad Photoshop file. Let's open that up. And it's going to ask us, this is not in your search path. This is not in your texture path. Do you want to create a copy? And most of the time I say yes. And this is because it collects all of your textures together so they don't get lost for Cinema 4D. But now, more importantly, we have our image on a texture. So now what we could create is right up here. It's in this menu. It's called a background object. And this background object, we can now apply our texture directly to, and now we have a background. Well, you can see it's looking okay, but it's squished. And by default, you may also have this default. The default ratio for Cinema 4D might be 4:3. And we shot this video in 16:9 in a widescreen format. So we need to change our kind of output to make sure this background maps properly. And to do that, we need to go into our render settings, and we need to go into output. And right here, it says standard 4:3. We need to change that to 16:9. And this is probably the ratio that your footage is filmed in. Even if it's an iPhone or a DSLR, you will probably be at a 16:9. And so now when we go back to view, you can see now it's the correct aspect ratio. And what we're going to do is use this frame to kind of make sure our logo looks correct, right? We want to make sure the perspective is correct on this logo, because if we're looking down on the logo, well, that doesn't seem right. And if we're looking too far up on it, that doesn't seem right. What we need to be able to do is kind of position it and make sure we're in the right zone. One thing that will help us, and this is something to always be aware of in 3D and After Effects, is to choose the right camera length. So what you want to do is make sure you match your camera in 3D, in Cinema 4D, to the same type of camera length, lens length that you use to shoot the film with. So in this case, we want to go ahead down here and pick 40 because I shot this with a 20 millimeter on a cropped lens, on a double cropped lens. So a 20 millimeter lens on a normal camera will be 40. And that's how I came up with that number, because of my cropping. Now you can learn a little bit more about cropping and the chips on other videos on Vimeo Video School. They have some of those. But for now, you just want to make sure your perspective is pretty close. We're also going to use this kind of grid line here to try to place that on the ground and kind of get a rough idea and get our perspective right, which that looks about right. And then what we could do is grab our logo and move it up in the scene. And when we hit render now, you see we still don't have lighting on our logo, but we're trying to get the perspective right. So it looks like it's starting to be in the scene, and that's what we want. We want the illusion that this was always in the scene when we filmed it. So perspective is a big part of that. You want to make sure that things like these lines correspond with the lines of the logo. You know, you could see we can't see the bottom of the logo. We could kind of see just over the top of it. We're kind of centered right on the top, and that seems about right to me. So play around a little bit with it. Keep hitting render until it looks okay. Now, we have our perspective okay. We have our background looking good. What we need to do now is light this logo using the image that we saved out of After Effects, this Photoshop image. And this is a little bit of a cheat. We could go, set up lights here and try to emulate this, but we also have this nice thing going on, which is a kind of a cloudy day, which is going to help us. We don't have to worry too much about shadows and getting all of our shadows correct, because we kind of have no shadows. It's kind of this shadowless, cloudy day, and that will actually help us in this composition and in this composite. So what we can do is we can actually light this logo with this image. Let me show you how to set that up. If you come up to this menu again, you're going to see a sky object. If we add the sky object, we can then add our background image onto the sky object. And let me just zoom out here and rotate around and show you what has been set up. This sky object took our image and roughly kind of mapped it around our scene. And what this is going to do is it's going to help us set up a way to light this logo with the original lighting from the original scene. And in a way, this is almost an HDRI trick, but it works in a similar way. It's not perfect, but for what we're creating, and I think it'll look pretty good. So what we have to do is we need a way to say, listen, you need to light this object with the surrounding pixel data. And the way we do this is under render settings, we need to go to Effect and go to Global Illumination. And there's a setting in Global Illumination that will allow you to do exactly this. And this setting is called Sky Sampler. So if you just go to your GI mode and go Sky Sampler, what this does is it's made exactly for this purpose. It's made to say, look at the sky object, look at the brightness and color values of your sky object, and try to roughly light this object with all of this pixel data that we have from our image. And again, this is a rough idea, but now we're actually lighting our logo. Let's go ahead and hit render. We're rendering our logo with the brightness and color values that surround it. And this is going to help us with realistic comp a bunch, right? One thing we need to do is turn off the sky on the camera. What we don't want to do is see the sky object. We do want the sky object to light the scene, but we don't want to see it in the final render. And to do that, we have to go to our tags here. Make sure your sky object is selected. Go to tags, go to Cinema 4D tags, and go to compositing. Now in this compositing tag, you're going to find this setting right here called Scene by Camera. You just want to turn that off. Okay, and now you want to line this logo back up here. Make sure our perspective is looking good, and hit render again. And now you can see it's looking a lot better. It's a little bit dark. So what we can do to brighten this up is go to our render settings and go to our primary intensity, which is right here. And we want to turn this up, something like maybe 200. You also want to worry about your gamma as well. So maybe even something like 1.8 gamma or 2.2 will help us make this a little bit brighter and a little bit more realistic. Right there, you can see it's a lot bright, even too bright. And I think the combination of the gamma and the primary intensity may have kind of doubled it up a little bit. So let's turn that primary intensity down a little bit, and we're getting closer. Now you're going to see now our logo is setting a little bit more into the scene. The color values are similar. The white isn't just a pure white. It's kind of this grayish color to correspond with our background. But we're still missing a lot of detail in the shadows. And what we could do to help that is to add another render setting effect here. And what we need to add is, if you go to Effects, go to Ambient Occlusion. And what ambient occlusion does, let's just go back and render it and see the difference. What ambient occlusion does is it fills in all the gaps and all the little details in your scene with shadows. So as things start to touch and as things start to create little cracks and edges and crevices here, like this area, inside the bevel here, you're going to start to see shadowing. And this emulates shadows in real life, where corners meet, less light gets to it, and more shadow exists. And this is a nice little tip, a nice little way to add that detail into your scene without going crazy on render time. So that helped us a lot. So already I'm liking the composite here. I like the reflections. Of course, there's a lot of work we need to do when we get into After Effects to make this a better composite, but we're looking pretty close. One thing I will mention is our settings on ambient occlusion by default is set pretty low, and that's because if you're using ambient occlusion in an animation sequence, these settings are pretty solid. But for still, which we're going to do, we're just going to export this as a still. We can actually turn these settings up. And that's something to keep in mind when you start talking about settings. And I should explain what I did there, but let me finish this thought. When you start talking about settings, you have to realize how long the renders will take, especially in 3D. And if you're working with a still image, you can kind of crank the settings up because it's just one frame you need to export. But if you're working in animation, you have to be aware that every frame is going to take a long time. When you add that up for 30 frames a second or 24 frames a second, it's going to start to kind of add up. But again, so in this case, we can actually turn these up. So the accuracy, I'm going to turn up to something like 75. And the minimum samples I think are fine, but the maximum samples, let's just go ahead and crank that up to 150. And that's just going to give us a little bit cleaner render when we get to export. And so from here, let's take a look at where we are. Let's just click the render button. And you can see it's looking pretty good. Our perspective looks pretty close. Maybe we're looking up at it just a little bit. Let's zoom back a little bit too. Make sure we get our perspective right. One thing I'm missing is I don't have a sense that this is near the ground. And one thing that we can do is kind of put a fake ground in our scene to then act as a way to create shadows on the bottom edge of our type. In other words, the bottom edge of this logo is just too bright. In this kind of day, there should be way more darker, shadowy stuff going on at the bottom edges of this logo, just because there's all this dark stuff. There's these dark railroad tracks and all this. And the reason this isn't performing the way it should is because we really have no floor in 3D. And this is a really simple fix. We just add a plane, we kind of move it down, and we can kind of scale it up. And we can actually use this plane as a way to fix the perspective as well. But now when we render, you're going to see that the bottom edge is a lot more shadowy. You see all this other detail we have now in our kind of corners and in our cracks. This is what we want. But of course, what we don't want is this big gray square to render with our final logo. So we just add that compositing tag again. Under tags, Cinema 4D tags, go to compositing and just say scene by camera off. And now when we do a render, you're going to see, there we go. We're adding a lot more shadowing now to the bottom. This to me looks a lot more realistic. It's a lot darker on the bottom and a lot and still as bright as it was on the top. And now we're starting to see this set into our scene a little bit more. And again, we're going to fully composite this in After Effects, but we want to get close in 3D. It's really hard to get perfect in a perfect render here in 3D, and that's why we're going to move into After Effects. But you do want to get close. You want to get as close as you can without going too crazy. So we look pretty close to done. Let's get this thing rendered out, and then in the next video, we're going to head into After Effects and we're going to composite this. So let me show you how to get this prepared. One thing we could do is, again, make sure our settings are nice and high to get us as much detail into After Effects as we can. So in our ambient occlusion, maybe we even crank our accuracy up to 90 and give it a few more samples, maybe 200 as our maximum samples. And again, I would never do this with animation, but with a still image, we could really take advantage of this nice renderer by cranking up some of these settings. I think we're okay in global illumination except for our sky sampler. If we go into our sky details, we have samples, and right now by default we're going to have 64 samples. And again, this may be okay for animation, but for a still, let's go ahead and crank this up. Something like 150 samples. Let's go ahead and double it. And the last thing we want to make sure we turn on and up is the anti-aliasing, and we want to make sure we're on best anti-aliasing, especially for stills, and that should be enough for now. So let's click render, and you can see now it's taking much longer to render here, and that's because we did turn up a lot of our samples, but this is going to give us a really nice image in After Effects that we could then, color correct and composite into our scene and do a bunch of fun stuff. So that looks pretty good to me. Let's set this up for render and get out of here. The last thing we need to do is turn off the background. And again, we imported this background to make sure our kind of angles looked okay and that it was the right kind of angle for the scene, but we don't want it to render out. And again, all we have to do is go to our background, and we can actually turn this off directly. And the way we do that is we hold Option or Alt on your keyboard, and we click these little traffic lights here, and we click it once to make it green, and I'm going to click it twice to make them both red. And once both of those are red, it's actually off in the scene. It's almost like if we were to delete it, but it's still in there in case we want it later on. So now when we render, we're just going to do a quick render here in the viewport. You can see now what we have is our logo on its own that is now isolated. So what we want to do is we want to export this with an alpha channel so that we can pull it into After Effects and composite it. So if we go to our render settings, we're going to go to output, and we're going to make sure we have enough resolution so that we can kind of play around with it in After Effects. One thing we could do is we could lock the ratio. What this lock ratio is going to do is lock this 16:9 aspect ratio, which we want. And now we can make this really high. We're going to make it a little bit larger than HD, and that's going to allow us to play with it in After Effects and scale it up and down without worrying about losing resolution. Because remember, you can always scale it down and it'll look nice, but scaling things up in After Effects or anywhere, it's always going to add a little bit of blurriness. So that looks all good to me. I think we have everything ready to go. The last thing we need to do is go to Save and pick where we save this logo. In here, I'm going to save it in my Vimeo school. I'm going to call it Vimeo Logo 3D. Okay, I'm going to click Save. And we're also going to turn on our alpha channel, and we're going to also turn on our straight alpha channel. And this is going to make it so we can composite this better in After Effects. Looks like we have everything ready to go. I'm going to hit Shift R on my keyboard. And what that's going to do is it's going to pop this into our render picture viewer, and it's going to start rendering. And let's back out here. And what you'll see is your scene will start to render, and you may have a different number of buckets going on. You may have 2 or 4, and that all depends on how many chips are in your computer. So if you have a couple less buckets, that's okay. Just let this go. Again, with animation, you always have to be aware of how long things take to render. But for this still, we can kind of wait a little bit. So that took about 30 seconds for me. And that is ready to go for After Effects. So let's, in the next video here, that's pretty much all we need from Cinema 4D. In the next video, what we're gonna do is we're gonna bring this logo into After Effects. We're gonna track our video and then set this thing in the scene and do a lot more compositing with depth of field and fun stuff. So hope to see you in the next video, which is all about After Effects. See you guys there.